Welcome back to Next Gen Console Watch, our show following all the news and rumors on the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. I'm Daemon Hatfield, and as always, I'm joined by Jonathon Dornbush, host of IGN's PlayStation podcast, Podcast Beyond.
Beyond. Hey, Damon.
And Ryan McCaffrey, host of IGN's Xbox podcast, Podcast Unlocked.
Hello, Damon. We're together. We wish you were here, but we're getting closer.
It's amazing.
I know, it's the same crew you recognize, but the show might look a little different. We're using our dual studio setup for the first time, so I'm here in the IGN studio in Los Angeles. Ryan and Jonathon are up in San Francisco in the studio together, which makes me a little bit worried because sometimes those two guys don't play very nicely together. Things can get a little bit heated. I think some blood has been spilled a time or two, so please, Ryan and Jonathon, for the love of God, try to keep things civil up there together in San Francisco.
No promises.
Today, okay?
Forget it.
No promises at all.
Okay, well, in just a little bit, we'll be talking about Gotham Knights, which is now a fully next-gen game. It's leaving the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions behind. But our big story this week, PlayStation 5, despite the fact that it sells out immediately whenever it pops up, still remains a very hotly sought-after item that lots of people out there still unfortunately haven't gotten their hands on. Despite all that, it missed its 2021 fiscal year 2021 sales target for Sony, although Sony does believe that fiscal year 2022 is going to be the best year yet for PS5, and things should get a little bit easier to find one out there in the not-so-distant future. So, PlayStation 5 has now sold 19.3 million units for those keeping score. If it had sold the additional 3 million units that Sony originally thought it would in the past year, it would have already outsold the lifetime sales of the Nintendo GameCube, which sits at 22 million. Sony originally forecasted selling 14.8 million units of PS5 hardware in its second year on the market, but it actually came in at just 11.5 million units. As you'd expect, Sony puts down this underperformance to the ongoing difficulty with securing hardware components because of the global shortage. Now, despite missing the previous year's goal, Sony did set its goal for fiscal year 2022, which will run through the end of March 2023. The new goal is higher than ever before. They think they're going to sell 18 million PS5 units in that time period, which, again, for those that are keeping score, if they do, at the end of March next year, they will have sold 37 million units and will have outsold the lifetime sales of the Nintendo 64. Sony's chief financial officer, Hiroki Totoki, said in his earnings call that that number is based on our current visibility into parts procurement. So it's actually, it's based on data that they feel like they've secured some new parts. They're going to be able to manufacture more of these things over the next year. Jonathon, what to make all of this? Things should get better. Do you share Mr. Totoki's confidence that Sony's going to be able to ship and sell 18 million units in the next year?
I mean, I don't have access to the same books, the financial bookings, so probably not exactly the same confidence, but I certainly hope so. I don't know what has sort of changed. Obviously, PlayStation wouldn't get into the nitty-gritty of that. I can only assume it was a sort of Fast and Furious style heist of a truck to get the parts they need. But no, however they were able to, if they're predicting to essentially double the PS5 user base in the next year, this is something we talked about on Beyond. They don't just want to put that number out there lightly, because putting that projection out there, if they fall short of it, means bad news for their stock, means bad news from shareholders. And they don't want that. So that is probably something they feel, at least at this point, fairly confident enough in. But to the CFO's point, they're still selling out PS5s like crazy. Everyone they put out there, they sell. So I completely understand the sentiment that even if they get that many out there, even if they double the user base in the next year, they're still not meeting the demand. We are seeing, I think, a greater demand for this generation, more so than the last generation, and more so of the last few generations outside of things, like the fervor for the Wii or things of that nature. So I think that's always going to be a problem so long as parts procurement is a continued issue, which it seems like it's going to be for a little bit. But I do hope this works out. I really do.
I do like the idea of Sony saying, we found the parts we need. They fell off a truck. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's fine.
It is a good point. With these sales projections, they want to be as accurate as possible, right? Otherwise, they'll end up in a situation that they just found them in, where they are, they came in at 3 million less than they announced they thought they would sell, right?
Yeah, the hope is to make sure that they are living up to what they're promising for their shareholders, because that only looks better at the end of the fiscal year. And at the end of the day, this is something we're not going to see those 18 million suddenly out there in the wild tomorrow. I think for players out there who are hoping for a PS5, it's still going to probably be a little bit, but hopefully, especially I assume they're going to make a very big push for the holiday to be able to have as many out there as possible. But yeah, hopefully the supply starts to be better. I know that in the UK, the PS5 had its best month of sales in April, according to gamesindustry.biz. So there seemed to be stock out there. So hopefully that only continues to be the case as we get further into the year.
And Ryan, the situation has been a little bit rosier for Xbox. We know that it was the best-selling console of the first quarter of the year in terms of dollars made. The Series X costs the same as PS5, and the Series S costs less. So presumably, presumably Xbox has been able to manufacture more consoles than Sony has. Any idea as to why or how Microsoft was able to get their hands on more components than Sony?
Well, I mean, we talked the last week or two about the Series S being kind of this secret weapon of sorts. If the yields are higher off of a single wafer, you can suddenly make more consoles with the same amount of silicon than you can a PS5 or a Series X. So that is certainly an ace up Microsoft's sleeve here. But yeah, I mean, I track everything in the Tesla world pretty closely, and Elon Musk likes to say, with production will only move as fast as the slowest part in the entire supply chain. However many dozens or hundreds of parts might go into a console. In a car's case, it's 10,000. But Sony didn't explicitly state chips, silicon. It could be something else. But yeah, it's really interesting that I wonder if Sony is really putting the feet to the fire on their suppliers to say, hey, you guys better step up, or we're going to find somebody else. Or I feel like there's a good book to be written about just the launching these things in a pandemic, and even in these first couple of years. Like this, this is a really fascinating time in console history. Whether it's Microsoft having secured higher parts orders ahead of time, and we can credit their planning, or whether I don't quite know what the reason is, but yeah, Microsoft seems to be, at least to the end user, able to meet demand a bit better than Sony can at this point. But this is a great sign for our industry and and what we're lucky enough to do here at IGN, that unending demand for these, even a year and a half in, with really no end to that demand in sight.
Yeah, the fact that PlayStation is essentially saying we'll have twice the amount of PS5s out, and that still isn't good enough for this time period. I do think we're in, whether this is a longer cycle as well, potentially because of people taking so long to get to these consoles, I do think that we're just going to see continued interest. Devs finally, like we're seeing, games really start to focus on next gen as their primary console, and so hopefully, it gets as much of a player base as possible in. But yeah, I think we're going to still be looking at the next few years for people to really get into that deeper player base.
And I would also think that any plans, these companies plan everything out so far in advance. Yeah. They probably knew 3 years ago when they thought they might drop the price from $4.99. Like, okay, maybe 3 years in, we drop $50 because our costs will be lower. I got to figure that's pushed way out, that we're not going to. I mean, we saw the Nintendo Switch just got its first cut after almost 5 years? Yeah. 4.5 years, I guess, at this point. And so I imagine price cuts are pushed out for both the Xbox and the PlayStation 5. As are, which we've touched on this show before, the inevitable mid-cycle console refresh too. Exactly. That's probably pushed out, I would think, at least like a year as well for each of them.
And then the price cut point is really interesting, just because PlayStation will always, they continue to make the point in these earnings that they took a cut on the PS5. They're selling them at a loss, and they always make a big point of that. And obviously that happens with a lot of consoles, but that seems to be a very big sticking point for them this generation. It's like, we were selling these things from day one at a loss. So yeah, especially with the demand still being there, they probably don't see a need to make that cut and make it even more of a loss. And it'll, as they ramp up production, be able to do so, they'll only make more money on each console. So yeah, it's going to be a really interesting generation.
Well, a couple episodes on this show, we ran a poll asking our viewers which platform they thought would be the best-selling console by the end of this year, and PlayStation 5 won. I was a little bit skeptical about that, but I don't know, maybe if if their prediction is accurate, if they can basically double the amount of PlayStation 5s in the wild by the end of March next year, I don't know, maybe it will be the best-selling console by the end of the year. Time will tell. Looking ahead to the end of the year, a game coming out, Gotham Knights, got a new gameplay trailer this week. And also news that it has abandoned its PS4 and Xbox One versions. It's now a next-gen, current-gen only game, as well as PC. Coming to PS5 and Xbox Series X, what is it, October 25th. So two platforms, two old-gen platforms abandoned, and nobody seemed to mind, I don't think. Looking at the comments on IGN, everyone seemed to be, a lot of people were like, it's about time. It's about time we started getting some current-gen only games for our current-gen consoles. Jonathan, what do you think? Is it time to go fully next-gen? Is it time to leave that PlayStation 4 behind? Sony recently said they're ramping up production of the PS4 because they can't get enough PS5s out there.
We had that report, and it's very curious to see, obviously, with this new announcement that the PS5 will have this uptick, presumably, in production. I'm hopeful that that means we'll start to see a push forward, because I can only imagine how taxing that is on the developers, not just to have to worry about optimizing so many generations, but especially, as I think we've talked about on the show, the cyberpunk effect of it all. At this point, you know, obviously they're looking for it to run best on the newer consoles and the PC. And when you have those older consoles that you still need to meet benchmarks for so that they're playable, you can still run into all these problems. And it is a bad publicity move if those versions are not running well, no matter how many players it opens it up to. That's, of course, the big frustration, is just that there's 100 plus PlayStation 4 players and however many Xbox One players who maybe have not been able to get a console, who just won't be able to with this game if they were looking forward to it. But that said, if it allows the devs to be able to focus on the versions that they know are running the best and avoids any sort of version that, even if it was sold, isn't fun to play, if it's broken, if it's messy, and they just weren't able to get it there without a huge amount of resources, I don't blame them for wanting to abandon that, as disappointing as that is for those players.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is we're 5 months from the launch of this game, and only just now are the old-gen versions being canceled. So, you know, we haven't seen the Xbox One and PS4 versions of this game, but I think it is reasonable to presume that it's a performance-related thing. Otherwise, they would have canned these versions a long time ago. Like they clearly were planning on them happening, and now they've decided not to. And I think it's fair to draw a straight line from Cyberpunk 2077 to this game, because if you're WB, you've seen your trailers, your gameplay videos get tens of millions of views across IGN and your own channels. And you probably look at Gotham Knights as the start of a franchise.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what you could have WB Montreal working on very profitably for this entire generation that we're just getting into.
Yeah.
But if you were to put out a subpar old-gen version, you risk shooting that entire potential franchise right in the foot before it gets started, or at least, you know, really hampering it. So, you know, they probably think the longer-term safer move is to, okay, we're not going to get the sales of these. I mean, the combined installed base for the PS4 and Xbox One is, what, probably 160, 170 million, something like that. So that's a lot of potential money to leave on the table. But, you know, that versus Gotham Knights 2 in 4 years from now. People saying, forget it, I bought the last one on my last console and it sucked, so forget it. So I gotta figure that the cyberpunk effect here, the lessons are clearly applied to this situation.
And the WB of it all is a really interesting point too, because it's not just the potential for Gotham Knights, but, you know, it's been so long since Arkham Knight, and they're clearly going all in on DC games with this, with Suicide Squad, with Wonder Woman. Like, this is the start of hopefully their next generation of superhero games that Marvel has been starting to nail. And so to come out of the gates on the wrong foot, that's mixed metaphors, but it would cause a public perception issue no matter how good the next gen versions are. The conversation would be, but look at how badly these versions are running.
I mentioned the reception to this news seemed to be largely positive, as far as I could tell, but there were some holdouts. IGN user Jordan1278, I wanted to share this. In reaction to the news that the PS4 and Xbox One versions of Gotham Knights were canceled, he said, that would be good news if current-gen consoles could be found in the market. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Since the chip shortage occurred, you can enter a store and current-gen consoles are nowhere to be found. My point is that until the shortage of current-gen consoles is resolved, every new game should be cross-gen so that everyone can have access to it. How do we react to that?
Well, there are a couple. It's a fair point. It is a totally fair point. But there's a couple things I would say on the optimistic side. Number one, the opportunity is there because Microsoft has already demonstrated it on the Xbox with Microsoft Flight Simulator, where maybe a deal is made with WB in, near launch, at launch, 6 months after launch, a year after launch, where they bring Gotham Knights to Game Pass and have you be able to stream it through the cloud, through Game Pass, to your Xbox One, similar to what they did with the next-gen only Microsoft Flight Simulator. And then I think the other thing I would say optimistically is I totally empathize with that with folks who are still on the PS4 and Xbox One, but by the time once you're able to procure that new console, and if you're still interested in Gotham Knights, it'll probably be half price, so you can still jump into it. But I completely get, you want to be there for the day one water cooler conversation. So there's no easy answer to that.
Yeah, I think it is, with this situation in particular, it is a bummer in particular for players, if only because that version was announced and promised to an extent. I think, there are devs who clearly want to be able to take the most advantage of next gen, want to be able to make games for it, want to be able to put all the resources to that. And so I think it's an easier pill to swallow if a game is just announced for that. It is a bummer that only a few PlayStation players have been able to play Returnal and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart and Demon's Souls, even though there are a huge amount of PlayStation 4 players who would probably love those games.
Yeah.
But I also understand why those teams prioritize developing for a singular piece of hardware to take advantage of it. And so I think there's going to be a continuing growth of next gen only, the newest gen only announced games at this point. But I do think it is a fair frustration to feel that when you were promised a game to be like, well, now I can't play it. And it's not people's faults. It is the reality of the world that we're living in.
Yeah, people probably had pre-orders in for the last gen version of the game.
Exactly, and so they're just not able to get that now, and they thought they were. And I think that frustration is totally fair and valid, and I hope that doesn't happen too often. I hope that at this point, we're long enough into this generation that companies, if they're going to do last gen, are able to stick with it, or to be able to say, no, we have to make that break and move forward. But, it is, as we were saying, an over 150 million plus user base that you may be ignoring. And that can be a frustrating thing as a player if you're not able to get access to that stuff. Absolutely.
Well, funnily enough, this move, canceling the last gen versions, will probably raise the bar of what people expect to see from the current gen version of Gotham Knights. So it kind of puts even more pressure on WB in some ways. We'll see how it shakes out when Gotham Knights launches later this year, October 25th on PS5, Series X, and PC. Before we go, we have the results of last week's poll. We asked you, what series would you like to see return for next gen? We're talking about Embracer Group and how they have an incredible stable of IP and franchises under their umbrella now. The winning result, perhaps surprisingly, was actually not Tomb Raider. The winner was Legacy of Kain, a series that has been dormant for 2 decades now. There hasn't been any talk of reviving it, but although I would certainly welcome a new Legacy of Kain game that beat out Tomb Raider and then also Deus Ex. Those 3 were sort of all really near the top. Not Thief, though. Thief was way near the bottom. I guess 2014's Thief didn't do much to gain that series any new fans. A poll for you to vote on for next week. We want to know, when Gotham Knights comes out, which character do you plan to main? Batgirl, Nightwing, Red Hood, Robin. Make sure to vote at IGN.com, and we'll share the results with you next week. And that will do it for this edition of Next Gen Console Watch. I think the dual studio shoots went pretty smoothly. Thank you so much for Ryan and Jonathan for keeping level heads, not letting your your hot spirits get the better of you. I know you guys have a hard time getting along, being on opposite sides of the aisle. I'm just kidding. We're all very good friends here, and this is a really fun and friendly show. Thanks to everyone working behind the studios to make this possible. It was sort of tricky getting all this set up, but I think things went pretty well, and hopefully they'll go even more smoothly. Next week, we'll be back next Friday, 6 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern, with more PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X news. We'll see you then.